Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of The Reading Corner with MooseChangerPat.
That's me, in case you're wondering.
Today we are reading Book 2 of the Belgariad, Queen of Sorcery by David Eddings. And as always, you should buy the original yada yada yada. Chapter 7. Sir Mandorallen, Baron of Vomandor, was a man of slightly more than medium height. His hair was black and curly, his eyes were deep blue, and he had a resonant voice in which he expressed firmly held opinions. Garion did not like him. The knight's towering self-confidence and egotism so pure that there was a kind of innocence about it seemed to confirm the worst of Leldarin's dark pronouncements about membrates, and Mandorallen's extravagant courtesy to Aunt Paul struck Garion as beyond the bounds of proper civility. To make matters even worse, Aunt Paul seemed to be quite willing to accept the knight's flatteries at face value. As they rode through the continuing drizzle along the Great West Road, Garion noted with some satisfaction that his companions appeared to share his opinion. Barrick's expression spoke louder than words. Silk's eyebrows lifted sardonically at each of the knight's pronouncements, and Dernick scowled. Garion, however, had little time to sort out his feelings about the membrate. He rode close beside the litter upon which Leldarin tossed painfully as the Algoth poison seared in his wounds. He offered his friend what comfort he could, and exchanged frequent worried looks with Aunt Paul, who rode nearby. During the worst of Leldarin's paroxysms, Garion helplessly held the young man's hand, unable to think of anything else to do to ease his pain. "Bear thine infirmity with fortitude, good youth," Mandorallen cheerfully advised the injured Asturian after a particularly bad bout that left Leldarin gasping and moaning. "This discomfort of thine is but an illusion. Thy mind can put it to rest if thou wouldst have it so." "That's exactly the kind of comfort I'd expect from a membrate," Leldarin retorted from between clenched teeth. "I think I'd rather you didn't ride so close. Your opinions smell almost as bad as your armor." Mandorallen's face flushed slightly. "The venom which doth rage through the body of our injured friend hath, it would seem, bereft him of civility as well as sense," he observed coldly. Leldarin half raised himself in the litter as if to respond hotly, but the sudden movement seemed to aggravate his injury, and he lapsed into unconsciousness. "His wounds are grave," Mandorallen stated. "Thy poultice, Lady Pulgera, may not suffice to save his life." "He needs rest," she told him. "Try not to agitate him so much." "I will place myself beyond the reach of his eye," Mandorallen replied. "Through no fault of mine own, my visage is hateful to him, and doth stir him to unhealthful colour." He moved his war horse ahead at a canter until he was some distance in front of the rest of them. "Do they all talk like that?" Garion asked with a certain rancor. "These and thous and doths?" "Membrates tend to be very formal," Aunt Paul explained. "You'll get used to it." "I think it sounds stupid," Garion muttered darkly, glaring after the knight. "An example of good manners won't hurt you all that much, Garion." They rode on through the dripping forest as evening settled among the trees. "Aunt Paul," Garion asked finally. "Yes, dear." "What was that Grom talking about when he said that about you and Torak?" "It's something Torak said once when he was raving. The Grollums took it seriously, that's all." She pulled her blue cloak tighter about her. "Doesn't it worry you?" "Not particularly." "What was that prophecy the Grollum was talking about? I didn't understand any of that. The word prophecy, for some reason, stirred something very deep in him." "The Marine Codex," she answered. "It's a very old version, and the writing's almost illegible. It mentions companions, the bear, the rat, and the man who lived twice. It's the only version that says anything about them. Nobody knows for certain that it really means anything. Grandfather thinks it does, doesn't he? Your grandfather has a number of curious notions. Old things impress him, probably because he's so old himself. Garion was going to ask her about the prophecy that seemed to exist in more than one version, but Leldarin moaned then, and they both immediately turned to him. They arrived shortly thereafter at a Talnedran hostel with thick whitewashed walls and red-tile roof. Aunt Paul saw to it that Leldarin was placed in a warm room, and she spent the night sitting by his bed caring for him. Garion padded worriedly down the dark hallway in his stocking feet a half-dozen times before morning to check on his friend, but there seemed to be no change. By daybreak the rain had let up. They started out in the grayish dawn, with Mandorallen still riding some distance ahead, until they reached at last the edge of a dark forest and saw before them the vast open expanse of the Arengis central plain, dun-colored and sere in the last few weeks of winter. The knight stopped there and waited for them to join him, his face somber. "What's the trouble?" Silk asked him. Mandorallen pointed gravely at a column of black smoke rising from a few miles out on the plain. "What is it?" Silk inquired, his rat face puzzled. "Smoke in Arendia can mean but one thing," the knight replied, pulling on his plumed helmet. "Abide here, dear friends. I will investigate, but I fear the worst." He set his spurs on the flanks of his charger and leaped forward at a thunderous gallop. "Wait!" Beric roared after him, but Mandorallen rode on obliviously. "That idiot!" the big Cherrick fumed. "I'd better go with him in case there's trouble." "It isn't necessary," Leldarin advised weakly from his litter. "Not even an army would dare to interfere with him." "I thought you didn't like him," Beric said, a little surprised. "I don't," Leldarin admitted, "but he's the most feared man in Arendia. Even in Asturia we've heard of Sir Mandorallen. No sane man would stand in his way." They drew back into the shelter of the forest and waited for the knight to come back. When he returned, his face was angry. "It is as I feared," he announced. "A war doth rage in our path, a senseless war, since the two barons involved are kinsmen and the best of friends." "Can we go around it?" Silk asked. "Nay, Prince Keldar," Mandorallen replied. "The conflict is so widespread that we would be waylaid ere we had gone 3 leagues. I must, it would appear, buy us passage." "Do you think they'll take money to let us pass?" Dernick asked dubiously. "In Arendia there is another way to make such purchase, good man," Mandorallen responded. "May I prevail upon thee to obtain 6 or 8 stout poles, perhaps 20 feet in length and about as thick as my wrist at the butt?" "Of course." Dernick took up his axe. "What have you got in mind?" Beric rumbled. "I will challenge them," Mandorallen announced calmly. "One or all. No true knight would refuse me without being called craven. Wilt thou be my second and deliver my challenge, my lord?" "What if you lose?" Silk suggested. "Lose?" Mandorallen seemed shocked. "I lose?" "Let it pass," Silk said. By the time Dernick had returned with the poles, Mandorallen had finished tightening various straps beneath his armor. Taking one of the poles, he vaulted into his saddle and started at a rolling trot toward the column of smoke, with Beric at his side. "Is this really necessary, Father?" Aunt Paul asked. "We have to get through, Paul," Mr. Wolf replied. "Don't worry, Mandorallen knows what he's doing." After a couple of miles, they reached the top of a hill and looked down at the battle below. 2 grim, black castles faced each other across a broad valley, and several villages dotted the plain on either side of the road. The nearest village was in flames, with a great pillar of greasy smoke rising from it to the lead-gray sky overhead, and serfs armed with scythes and pitchforks were attacking each other with a sort of mindless ferocity on the road itself. Some distance off, pikemen were gathered for a charge, and the air was thick with arrows. On 2 opposing hills, parties of armored knights with bright-colored pennons on their lances watched the battle. Great siege engines lofted boulders into the air to crash down on the struggling men, killing, so far as Garen could tell, friend and foe indiscriminately. The valley was littered with the dead and the dying. Stupid, Wolf muttered darkly. No one I know of has ever accused errands of brilliance, Silk observed. Mandorallen set his horn to his lips and blew a shattering blast. The battle paused as the soldiers and serfs all stopped to stare up at him. He sounded his horn again, and then again, each brassy note a challenge in itself. As the two opposing bodies of knights galloped through the knee-high, winter-yellowed grass to investigate, Mandorallen turned to Beric. "If it please thee, my lord," he requested politely, "deliver my challenge as soon as they approach us." Beric shrugged. "It's your skin," he noted. He eyed the advancing knights, and then lifted his voice in a great roar. "Sir Mandorallen, Baron of Vomander, desires entertainment," he declaimed. "It would amuse him if each of your parties would select a champion to joust with him. If, however, you are all such cowardly dogs that you have no stomach for such a contest, cease this brawling and stand aside so that your betters may pass." "Splendidly spoken, my Lord Beric," Mandorallen said with admiration. "I've always had a way with words," Beric replied modestly. The two parties of knights warily rode closer. "For shame, my lords," Mandorallen chided them. "Ye will gain no honor in this sorry war. Sir Darajan, what hath cost this contention?" "An insult, Sir Mandorallen," the noble replied. He was a large man, and his polished steel helmet had a golden circlet riveted above the visor. "An insult so vile that it may not go unpunished." "It was I who was insulted," a noble on the other side contended hotly. "What was the nature of this insult, Sir Ultorin?" Mandorallen inquired. Both men looked uneasily, and neither spoke. "Ye have gone to war over an insult which cannot even be recalled," Mandorallen said incredulously. "I had thought, my lords, that you were serious men, but I now perceive my error." "Don't the nobles of Erendia have anything better to do?" Beric asked in a voice heavy with contempt. "Of Sir Mandorallen, the bastard, we have all heard," a swarthy knight in a black enameled armor sneered. "But who is this red-bearded ape who so maligns his betters?" "You're going to take that?" Beric asked Mandorallen. "It's more or less true," Mandorallen admitted with a pained look. "Since there was some temporary irregularity about my birth, which still raises questions about my legitimacy, this knight is Sir Haldarin, my third cousin twice removed. Since it's considered unseemly in Erendia to spill the blood of kinsmen, he thus cheaply gains reputation for boldness by casting the matter in my teeth." "Stupid custom," Beric grunted. "Sure, kinsmen kill each other with more enthusiasm than they kill strangers." "Alas," Mandorallen sighed, "this is not Cherrick." "Would you be offended if I dealt with this?" Beric asked politely. "Not at all." Beric moved closer to the swarthy knight. "I am Beric, Earl of Trellheim," he announced in a loud voice, "kinsman to the King of Enheg of Cherrick, and I see that certain nobles in Erendia have even fewer manners than they have brains. The lords of Erendia are not impressed by the self-bestowed titles of the pigsty kingdoms of the north," Sir Haldarin retorted coldly. "I find your words offensive, friend," Beric said ominously. "And I find thy ape face and scraggly beard amusing," Sir Haldarin replied. Beric did not even bother to draw his sword. He swung his huge arm in a wide circle and crashed the fist with stunning force against the side of the swarthy knight's helmet. Sir Haldarin's eyes glazed as he was swept from his saddle, and he made a vast clatter when he struck the ground. "Would anyone else like to comment about my beard?" Beric demanded. Gently, my lord, Mandorallen advised. He glanced down with a certain satisfaction at the unconscious form of his senseless kinsman twitching in the tall grass. Will we docilely accept this attack on our own brave companion? One of the knights in Baron Darajan's party demanded in a harshly accented voice. Kill them all! He reached for his sword. In the instant thy sword leaves its sheath, thou art a dead man, Sir Knight, Mandorallen coolly advised him. The knight's hand froze in his sword hilt. For shame, my lords, Mandorallen continued accusingly. Surely you know that by courtesy and common usage my challenge, until it is answered, guarantees my safety and that of my companions. Choose your champions or withdraw. I tire of all this and presently will become irritable. The two parties of knights pulled back some distance to confer, and several men-at-arms came to the hilltop to pick up Sir Haldoran. That one who was going to draw his sword was a Murgo, Garen said quietly. I noticed that, Hedder murmured, his dark eyes glittering. They're coming back, Dernick warned. I will joust with thee, Sir Mandorallen, Baron Darajan announced as he approached. I doubt not thy reputation is well deserved, but I also have taken the prize in no small number of tourneys. I would be honored to try a lance with thee. And I, too, will try my skill against thine, Sir Knight, Baron Ulterain declared. My arm is also feared in some parts of Erendia. Very well, Mandorallen replied. Let us seek level ground and proceed. The day wears on, and my companions and I have business to the south. They all rode down the hill to the field below, where the two groups of knights drew up on either side of a course which had been quickly trampled out in the high yellow grass. Darajan galloped to the far end, turned and sat waiting, his blunted lance resting in his stirrup. Thy courage becomes thee, my lord, Mandorallen called, taking up one of the poles Dernick had cut. I shall try not to injure thee too greatly. Art thou prepared to meet my charge? I am, the Baron replied, lowering his visor. Mandorallen clapped down his visor, lowered his lance, and set his spurs on his war horse. It's probably inappropriate under the circumstances, Silk murmured, but I can't help wishing that our overbearing friend could suffer some humiliating defeat. Mr. Wolf gave him a withering look. Forget it! Is he that good? Silk asked wistfully. Watch, Wolf told him. The two knights met in the center of the course with a resounding crash, and the lances both shattered at the stunning impact, littering the trampled grass with splinters. They thundered past each other, turned, and rode back, each to his original starting place. Darajan, Gary noticed, swayed somewhat in the saddle as he rode. The knights charged again, and their fresh lances also shattered. I should have cut more poles, Dernick said thoughtfully. But Baron Darajan swayed even more as he rode back this time, and on the third charge, his faltering lance glanced off Mandorallen's shield, and Mandorallen's lance, however, struck true, and the Baron was hurled from his saddle by the force of their meeting. Mandorallen reined in his charger and looked down at him. Art thou able to continue, my lord? He asked politely. Darajan staggered to his feet. I do not yield, he gasped, drawing his sword. Splendid, Mandorallen replied. I feared that I might have done thee harm. He slid out of his saddle, drew his sword, and swung directly at Darajan's head. The blow glanced off the Baron's hastily raised shield, and Mandorallen swung again without pause. Darajan managed one or two feeble swings before Mandorallen's broadsword caught him full on the side of the helmet. He spun once and collapsed face down on the earth. My lord, Mandorallen inquired solicitously. He reached down, rolled over his fallen opponent, and opened the dented visor of the Baron's helmet. Art thou unwell, my lord? He asked. Dost thou wish to continue? Darajan did not reply. Blood ran freely from his nose, and his eyes were rolled back in his head. His face was blue, and the right side of his body quivered spasmodically. Since this brave knight is unable to speak for himself, Mandorallen announced, I declare him vanquished. He looked around, his broadsword still in his hand. "Would any here gainsay my words?" There was a vast silence. "Will some few then remove him from the field?" Mandorallen suggested. "His injuries do not appear grave. A few months in bed should make him well again." He turned to Baron Altorian, whose face had grown visibly pale. "Well, my lord," he said cheerfully, "shall we proceed? My companions and I are impatient to continue our journey." Sir Altorian was thrown to the ground on the first charge, and broke his leg as he fell. "Ill luck, my lord," Mandorallen observed, approaching on foot with drawn sword. "Dost thou yield?" "I cannot stand," Altorian said from between clenched teeth. "I have no choice but to yield." "And I and my companion may continue our journey." "You may freely depart," the man on the ground replied painfully. "Not just yet," a harsh voice interrupted. The armored Murgo pulled his horse through the crowd of other mounted knights until he was directly in front of Mandorallen. "I thought he might try to interfere," Aunt Paul said quietly. She dismounted and stepped out onto the hoof-churned course. "Move out of the way, Mandorallen," she told the knight. "Nay, my lady," Mandorallen protested. Wolf barked sharply. "Move, Mandorallen!" Mandorallen looked startled and stepped aside. "Well, Grollum," Aunt Paul challenged, pushing back her hood. The mountain man's eyes widened as he saw the white lock in her hair, and then he raised his hand almost despairingly, muttering rapidly under his breath. Once again, Garen felt that strange surge, and the hollow roaring filled his mind. For an instant, Aunt Paul's figure seemed surrounded by a kind of greenish light. She waved her hand indifferently, and the light disappeared. "You must be out of practice," she told him. "Would you like to try again?" The Grollum raised both hands this time, but got no further. Maneuvering his horse carefully behind the armored man, Dernick had closed on him. With both hands, he raised his axe and smashed it directly on top of the Grollum's helmet. "Dernick!" Aunt Paul shouted. "Get away!" But the smith, his face set grimly, swung again, and the Grollum slid senseless from his saddle with a crash. "You fool!" Aunt Paul raged. "What do you think you're doing?" "He was attacking you, Mistress Paul," Aunt Dernick explained, his eyes still hot. "Get down off that horse!" He slid down. "Do you have any idea how dangerous that was?" she demanded. "He could have killed you!" "I will protect you, Mistress Paul," Dernick replied stubbornly. "I'm not a warrior or a magician, but I won't let anybody try to hurt you." Her eyes widened in surprise for an instant, then narrowed, then softened. Garion, who had known her from childhood, recognized her rapid changes of emotion. Without warning, she suddenly embraced the startled Dernick. "You great, clumsy, dear fool," she said. "Never do that again. Never. You almost made my heart stop." Garion looked away with a strange lump in his throat, and saw the brief sly smile that flickered across Mr. Wolf's face. A peculiar change had come over the knights lining the sides of the course. Several of them were looking around with the amazed expressions of men who had just been roused from some terrible dream. Others seemed suddenly lost in thought. Sir Altorian struggled to rise. "Nay, my lord," Mandorallen told him, pressing him gently back down. "That will do thyself injury." "What have we done?" the Baron groaned, his face anguished. Mr. Wolf dismounted and knelt beside the injured man. "It wasn't your fault," he informed the Baron. "Your war was the Murgo's doing. He twisted your minds and set you on each other." "Sorcery?" Altorian grasped, his face growing pale. Wolf nodded. "He's not really a Murgo, but a Grollum priest." "And the spell is now broken?" Wolf nodded again, glancing at the unconscious Grollum. "Chain the Murgo," the Baron ordered the assembled knights. He looked back at Wolf. "We have ways of dealing with sorcerers," he said grimly. "We will use the occasion to celebrate the end of our unnatural war. This Grollum sorcerer hath cast his last enchantment." "Good," Wolf replied with a bleak smile. "Sir Mandorallen," Baron Altorian said, wincing as he shifted his broken leg, "in what way may we repay thee and thy companions for bringing us to our senses?" "That peace hath been restored is reward enough," Mandorallen replied somewhat pompously. "For, as all the world knows, I am the most peace-loving man in the kingdom." He glanced once at Leldarin, lying nearby on the ground in his litter, and a thought seemed to occur to him. I would, however, ask a boon of thee. We have in our company a brave Asturian youth of noble family, who hath suffered grievous injury. We would leave him, if we might, in thy care. His presence shall honor me, Sir Mandorallen, Alterin assented immediately. The women of my household will care for him most tenderly. He spoke briefly to one of his retainers, and the man mounted and rode quickly toward one of the nearby castles. You're not going to leave me behind, Welderin protested weakly. I'll be able to ride in a day or so. He began to cough rackingly. I think not, Mandorallen disagreed with a cool expression. The results of thy wounding have not yet run their natural course. I won't stay with Mimbrates, Welderin insisted. I'd rather take my chances on the road. Young Welderin, Mandorallen replied bluntly, even harshly, I know thy distaste for the men of Mimber. Thy wound, however, will soon begin to abscess, and then suppurate, and the raging fever and delirium will afflict thee, making thy presence a burden upon us. We have not the time to care for thee, and thy sore need would delay us in our quest. Garen gasped at the brutal directness of the knight's words. He glared at Mandorallen with something very close to hatred. Welderin's face, meanwhile, had gone white. Thank you for pointing that out to me, Sir Mandorallen, he said stiffly. I should have considered it myself. If you'll help me to my horse, I'll leave immediately. You'll stay right where you are, Aunt pulled him flatly. Baron Alterin's retainer returned with a group of household servants and a blonde girl of about 17 wearing a rose-colored gown of stiff brocade and velvet color of teal. My younger sister, Lady Ariana, Alterin introduced her. She's a spirited girl, and though she is young, she is already well versed in the care of the sick. I won't trouble her for long, my lord, Welderin declared. I'll be returning to Asturia within a week. Lady Ariana laid a professional hand to his forehead. Nay, good youth, she disagreed. Thy visit, I think, will be protracted. I'll leave within the week, Welderin repeated stubbornly. She shrugged. As it please thee. I expect that my brother will be able to spare some few servants to follow after thee to provide thee that decent burial which, if I misjudge not, that will require before thou hast gone 10 leagues. Welderin blinked. Aunt Paul took Lady Ariana to one side and spoke with her at some length, giving her a small pocket of herbs and certain instructions. Welderin motioned to Garion, and Garion went to him immediately and knelt beside the litter. So it ends, the young man murmured. I wish I could go on with you. You'll be well in no time, Garen assured him, knowing that it wasn't true. Maybe you can catch up with us later. Welderin shook his head. No, he disagreed. I'm afraid not. He began to cough again, the spasm seeming to tear at his lungs. We don't have much time, my friend, he gasped weakly. So listen carefully. Garion, near tears, took his friend's hand. You remember what we were talking about the morning after we left my uncle's house? Garion nodded. You said that I was the one who'd have to decide if we were to break our pledge to Torsten and the others to keep silent. I remember, Garion told him. All right, Welderin said. I've decided. I release you from your pledge. Do what you have to do. It would be better if you told my grandfather about it yourself, Welderin, Garion protested. I can't, Garion, Welderin crowed. The words would stick in my throat. I'm sorry, but it's the way I am. I know that Natchak's only using us, but I gave the others my word. I'm an errand, Garion. I'll keep my word even though I know it's wrong, so it's up to you. You're going to have to keep Natchak from destroying my country. I want you to go straight to the king himself. To the king? He'd never believe me. Make him believe you. Tell him everything. Garen shook his head firmly. I won't tell him your name, he declared, or Torsten's. You know what he'd do to you if I did. We don't matter, Welderin insisted, coughing again. I'll tell him about Natchak, Garen said stubbornly, but not about you. Where do I tell him to find the Murgo? He'll know, Welderin replied, his voice very weak now. Natchak's the ambassador to the court of Omimber. He's the personal representative of King of the Murgos. Garion was stunned at the implication of that. He's got all the gold from the bottomless mines of Cathal Murgos at his command, Leldern continued. The plot he gave my friends and me could be one of a dozen or more, all aimed at destroying Arendia. You've got to stop him, Garion. Promise me. The pale young man's eyes were feverish and his grip on Garion's hand tightened. I'll stop him, Leldern, Garion vowed. I don't know how yet, but one way or another I'll stop him. Leldern sank weakly back on the litter, his strength seeming to run out as if the necessity for extracting that promise had been the only thing sustaining him. Goodbye, Leldern. Garion stood softly, his eyes filling with tears. Goodbye, my friend, Leldern barely more than whispered, and then his eyes closed, and the hand gripping Garion's went limp. Garion stared at him with a dreadful fear until he saw the faint flutter of his pulse in the hollow of his throat. Leldern was still alive, if only barely. Garion tenderly put down his hand's friend and pulled the rough gray blanket up around his shoulders. Then he stood up and walked quickly away with tears running down his cheeks. The rest of the farewells were brief, and they remounted and rode at a trot toward the Great West Road. There were a few cheers from the serfs and the pikemen as they passed, but in the distance there was another sound. The women from the villages had come out to search for their men among the bodies littering the field, and their wails and shrieks mocked the cheers. With deliberate purpose, Garion pushed his horse forward until he drew in beside Mandorallen. I have something to say to you, he said hotly. You aren't going to like it, but I don't really care. Oh? The knight replied mildly. I think the way you talked to Leldern back there was cruel and disgusting, Garion told him. You might think you're the greatest knight in the world, but I think you're a loudmouth braggart with no more compassion than a block of stone. And if you don't like it, what do you plan to do about it? Ah, Mandorallen said, that. I think that thou hast misunderstood my young friend. It was necessary in order to save his life. The Asturian youth is very brave, and so gives no thought to himself. Had I not spoken so to him, he would surely have insisted upon continuing with us, and would soon have died. Died? Garion scoffed. Aunt Paul could have cured him. It was Lady Pulgera herself who informed me that his life was in danger, Mandorallen replied. His honor would not permit him to seek proper care, but that same honor prevailed upon him to remain behind lest he delay us. The knight smiled wryly. He will, I think, be no fonder of me for my words than thou art, but he will be alive, and that's what matters, is it not? Garion stared at the arrogant-seeming membrate, his anger suddenly robbed of his target. With painful clarity, he realized that he had just made a fool of himself. I'm sorry, he apologized grudgingly. I didn't realize what you were doing. Mandorallen shrugged. It's not important. I'm frequently misunderstood. As long as I know that my motives are good, however, I'm seldom very concerned with the opinions of others. I'm glad, though, that I had the opportunity to explain this to thee. Thou art to be my companion, and it ill behooves companions to have misapprehensions about each other. They rode on in silence as Garion struggled to readjust his thinking. There was, it seemed, more to Mandorallen than he had suspected. They reached the highway then, and turned south again, under a threatening sky.